The screaming reached William Hartman before the smell did. He sat motionless on his horse at the edge of Red Mesa Trading Post, 52 years old with $15 in his pocket and a heart that beat like a broken clock. The animal beneath him sensed his hesitation, shifting weight from hoof to hoof, waiting for a decision its rider seemed incapable of making. Will had planned to ride straight through this god-forsaken town without stopping. His saddlebags held nothing but a change of clothes and a bottle of Digitalis he would need by nightfall. The ranch he had just sold, the last 3 head of Longhorn that represented everything he owned, had brought him exactly what he expected. Pity from the buyer and $15 in worn bills that felt obscene against his palm. Catherine had built that ranch with him. 22 years of sweat and hope and small victories that felt enormous at the time. She had died there 5 years ago, her body consumed by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could break. Michael, their son, had left 3 days after the funeral without saying goodbye, and Will understood why. He had been absent even when present, a ghost haunting his own life, always riding toward some distant conflict that felt more manageable than the intimacy of home. The screaming pulled him from these thoughts. It cut through the afternoon heat like broken glass through skin, raw and desperate and utterly human. Will had learned to ignore such sounds during his 20 years as a cavalry soldier. The Indian Wars had taught him that survival often meant selective deafness, looking away from things that would haunt you if you let them take root in your mind. Today, he could not look away. The slave market sat in the town's center like an infected wound. A wooden platform rose above packed earth, stained dark from years of human commerce. Will had seen markets like this throughout the territory, had ridden past them with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the horizon, telling himself that one man could not change the machinery of an entire economy built on suffering. 6 girls hung upside down from wooden posts. Their bodies bore marks that told stories Will did not want to read. Whip scars that crisscrossed brown skin, bruises in various stages of healing, dried blood that flies gathered upon with an obscene patience. Their ages ranged from perhaps 12 to early 20s. Apache, based on their features and the style of braiding still visible in their matted hair. The youngest had stopped screaming. Her eyes had gone somewhere else entirely, a mercy that consciousness sometimes granted when the body could no longer bear what was happening to it. The oldest still fought, her muscles trembling with the effort of holding her head up, refusing to surrender to gravity or despair. Traders stood nearby, drinking whiskey and laughing. One of them poured water over his own head to cool off, letting it stream down his face and chest while the girls baked in direct sunlight with cracked lips and eyes that had learned to stop asking for mercy. Will felt the familiar sickness rise in his stomach. He had promised Catherine he would never return to this darkness. She had made him swear it on their wedding day. Her small hands holding his scarred ones, her voice gentle but absolute. Promise me you'll leave the wars behind. Promise me you'll become the man you were meant to be, not the weapon they made you. He had promised. He had failed. Catherine was dead, and these girls were dying, and Will was about to turn his horse toward the desert to find a quiet place where a man with a failing heart could finally stop fighting. Then he saw the mark. The oldest girl's shoulder bore a tattoo burned into sun-darkened skin, a crescent moon with a twisted wing, spreading outward like the embrace of night itself. The moon wing, the sacred symbol of the Chiricahua Apache. The people who measured worth not by wealth or violence but by the choices a man made when no one was watching. Will's blood turned to ice. He knew that symbol. Had carried a piece of leather with that exact mark in his pocket for 24 years. Had looked at it on cold nights when the memories threatened to drown him. Had held it when Catherine died and whispered prayers to a god he was not sure existed. The memory crashed over him like a flash flood. Arizona Territory, 1860. Will was 28 years old and full of the dangerous confidence that gets young men killed. He had been a cavalry soldier for 6 years, fighting in conflicts he did not fully understand against enemies who were defending their own land from invaders who called it manifest destiny. His unit had engaged a raiding party of Comanche warriors near the Superstition Mountains. The battle went badly from the start. Arrows came from positions they had not anticipated, and the terrain favored defenders who knew every rock and shadow. Will took an arrow through the shoulder and fell from his horse into a ravine. His commanding officer never bothered searching. When he woke, the unit was gone. The arrow had driven clean through muscle and scraped bone. He could feel his pulse throbbing around the shaft, each heartbeat pumping more blood into the Arizona dirt. His canteen had shattered in the fall. His rifle was gone. His horse had fled or been taken. He crawled for 3 days. The arrow broke off on the second day, leaving the head buried in his shoulder where it would either work its way out or kill him with infection. By the 4th day, he had stopped crawling. His tongue had swollen too large for his mouth. His wound had begun to smell sweet, the unmistakable scent of rot claiming living flesh. He lay on his back staring at the burning sky and waiting for death to finish what the Comanche had started. That was when Chief Samuel Broken Arrow found him. Samuel was 35 years old, with silver already streaking his black hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone into the core of a man. He led a small hunting party of Chiricahua warriors who had every reason to leave Will where he lay, or to finish him quickly and take his weapons as trophies. Instead, Samuel knelt beside him and held a water skin to his cracked lips. Will would never forget the first words Samuel spoke. The chief's English was careful and deliberate, like he was weighing each syllable before releasing it into the world. "You wear the uniform of my enemy. Your people have taken our land and killed our families. I should leave you for the vultures." Will had no strength to respond. He could only stare up at this man who held his life in calloused hands. "But I see something in your eyes, young soldier. Not hatred. Something else? Perhaps regret? Perhaps the beginning of wisdom." Samuel lifted Will onto a horse and rode for 2 days to a hidden cave in the mountains. There the chief himself tended Will's wounds, removed the arrowhead with a knife heated in fire, packed the wound with herbs whose names Will did not know, changed the bandages, fed him broth, and forced him to drink when fever took hold, and tried to convince his body to quit. For 3 weeks, Samuel kept Will alive when every practical calculation said he should have let him die. On the last night before Will was strong enough to travel, Samuel sat with him at the cave mouth, watching stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. "Why did you save me?" Will asked, his voice still rough from weeks of silence. "After everything my people have done to yours." Samuel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. "Because, William Hartman, you are at a crossroads. The man you were is dying. The man you could become is waiting to be born. I chose to help that birth along." Samuel reached into his pouch and withdrew a small piece of leather. On it was burned the image of a crescent moon with spreading wings. "This is the moon wing, the sacred mark of my people. It represents the light that guides us through darkness and the wings that lift us above our worst selves." He pressed the leather into Will's palm, closing the younger man's fingers around it. "Carry this with you. Remember these words. If you ever see this mark on any of my people, know that they are family to the man who gave you a second life. The Chiricahua measure worth not by uniform or wealth, but by the choices made when no one is watching." Will had carried that leather for 24 years. Through marriage and fatherhood, through Catherine's illness and death, through the slow collapse of everything that had once given his life meaning. He carried it still. Now he stood in the brutal sun of Red Mesa Trading Post, staring at that same mark burned into the shoulder of a girl who hung upside down, bleeding from wounds inflicted by men who saw her as nothing more than property to be traded. Samuel Broken Arrow's daughter. It had to be. Will moved before his mind could catch up to his body. His boots kicked up dust as he pushed through the crowd of gawkers and potential buyers. Men turned to look at this weathered stranger with hard eyes and the way of walking that said he had seen violence and was not afraid of it. He reached the platform where a fat slave trader in a stained vest was shouting prices to the crowd. 6 of them, already broken in, prime merchandise. Who wants to start the bidding at $50? Will climbed the platform steps. The trader turned to face him with an expression caught between annoyance and calculation. "What do you want, old-timer?" Will did not answer immediately. He walked to where the oldest girl hung upside down and looked into her eyes. Even through pain and exhaustion and terror, he could see it. The same calm strength Samuel had carried. The same refusal to break even when the world was determined to destroy her. I want to buy them. All 6. The trader laughed. It was a wet, unpleasant sound, like a hog rooting through garbage. You and what fortune? These squaws are worth 200 minimum. You look like you couldn't buy a decent meal. Will reached into his pocket and pulled out his money. $15 in worn bills. Everything he had left in the world. The trader laughed harder. The crowd joined in. Someone shouted something crude about foolish old men and savage women. Will did not look away from the girl's eyes. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Hope, perhaps. Or the memory of hope from before such things were beaten out of her. He thought about Catherine, about the pocket watch she had given him on their wedding day. Gold and heavy and engraved with words that still made his heart ache. To William, my compass in the storm. All my love, Catherine, 1862. He had carried that watch for 22 years. It was the only piece of Catherine he had left, the only physical proof that their love had been real and that he had once been the kind of man who deserved such love. Will reached into his vest and pulled out the watch. The laughter died. Even the trader could see this was no ordinary timepiece. The gold gleamed in the afternoon sun like captured daylight. The trader's eyes grew hungry the way a coyote's eyes grow hungry when it spots an injured rabbit. That watch, the trader said slowly, his voice thick with greed, plus the $15. Will's hand trembled. Not from fear, from the weight of what he was about to sacrifice. Catherine's voice whispered through his memory, the last words she'd spoken before the fever took her. Don't let regret bury you, Will. Live for those who still need you. He placed the watch and the money on the platform floor. Deal. The trader snatched them up with greedy hands and waved at his men. Cut them down. The old fool bought himself some dying savages. Will caught the first girl as she fell, the one with the moonwing tattoo. She was lighter than he expected, as if suffering had burned away everything but bone and will. Her blood soaked through his shirt as he lowered her gently to the platform. Easy now. I've got you. Her eyes found his face, dark eyes that held pain beyond words, but also something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or the first fragile stirring of trust. Who are you? She whispered through cracked lips. Someone who owes your father everything. My name is William Hartman. Her eyes widened. For a moment, she seemed to forget her wounds and her terror, and the 5 sisters still being cut down around her. You're the soldier, the one from the cave. My father told me about you. He spoke of you every year on the anniversary of saving you. He called you the man who could have been different. He hoped you became different. Will felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen solid since Catherine's death beginning to crack and move again. I'm trying to be. I'm trying. He carried her down from the platform while his mind raced through possibilities and dangers. The crowd watched with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt. No one interfered. In the brutal economy of the frontier, a legal purchase was a legal purchase, no matter how strange the buyer or his motives. The other 5 girls followed on shaking legs. The youngest could barely walk. Will saw her stumble, and without thinking swept her up into his arms alongside her sister. Where are we going? The youngest asked. Her voice was small and frightened, but there was something else there too. A refusal to be completely broken that reminded Will painfully of Michael at that age. Somewhere safe. I promise. He led them through the back alleys of Red Mesa to an abandoned warehouse behind the market. The building was rotting and forgotten, but it had walls and a roof and shadows where they could hide while he figured out what to do next. Inside, light pierced through gaps in the tin roof and fell across their bruised, battered faces. Will sat both girls down carefully and turned to look at all 6 of them. 6 daughters of Samuel Broken Arrow. 6 lives that now depended on a broken old man with a failing heart. What had he done? Water first, he said, keeping his voice steady, even as doubt gnawed at his edges. Then we tend those wounds. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out his canteen and 2 strips of clean cloth. Not nearly enough for 6 wounded girls, but it was a start. It had to be a start. The oldest girl helped her sisters drink. Each of them sipped carefully, making the water last, making sure everyone got their share before taking more for themselves. Will watched this small act of generosity and felt something tighten in his throat. Samuel had raised them well. When the immediate thirst was addressed, the oldest girl turned to face Will directly. She moved stiffly, pain evident in every motion, but she held herself with a dignity that circumstances had not managed to destroy. "I am Nora Broken Arrow. These are my sisters." She pointed to each as she named them. "Maya is 21. Sarah is 19. Anna is 16. Claire is 14. Ruth is 12. Maya coughed wetly, and Will could see infection already spreading through the wounds on her back. Sarah sat in silence, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Anna and Claire pressed against each other, drawing what comfort they could from physical closeness. Ruth sat apart, watching Will with a directness that was almost unsettling. "My father spoke of you often," Nora continued. "He said you had a warrior's heart wrapped in a wanderer's clothes. He said saving you was one of the proudest moments of his life." Will felt the familiar weight of unworthiness settle over him. "Your father was a far better man than me." "Perhaps. But you're the man who came today. That's what matters now." Will knelt to examine Maya's wounds more closely. The infection was bad. She needed proper medicine and rest and time to heal, none of which they were likely to get. "What happened? How did you end up in that market?" Nora's face hardened. The story came out in pieces, each fragment sharp enough to cut. 4 weeks ago, a band of raiders led by a man named Victor Landry had attacked their village. But this was not a simple raid. Landry had arrived with papers, legal documents claiming that Chiricahua land actually belonged to him through a purchase from a tribal chief years earlier. The documents were forged. Nora knew this because the chief Landry claimed to have dealt with had been dead for decades before the supposed sale took place. But forged documents backed by armed men are difficult to argue against. Samuel had refused to accept the false claim. He had gathered evidence of the forgery and ridden to Fort Defiance to file a formal complaint with the territorial authorities. He believed in the law, believed that justice could be found through proper channels if only the truth could be heard. He was wrong. Landry had been waiting for him on the road back. An ambush, 20 men against 1. "My father fought," Nora said, and her voice cracked for the first time. "He fought until he couldn't fight anymore. They shot him in the back as he tried to reach his horse." Will closed his eyes. He could see it. Samuel Broken Arrow dying alone on a dusty road, betrayed by the laws he had trusted. His final thoughts probably of his daughters and whether they would survive what was coming. After he was dead, Landry's men came to the village. "They took us. All 9 of us." Will's head snapped up. "9? There are only 6 of you here. 3 more of my sisters were separated from us 2 weeks ago. Mia is 18. Sarah is 15. Luna is 13. Landry is keeping them at a place called Devil's Cut, a canyon 3 days' ride from here." Will knew the place by reputation. A narrow gorge in the Badlands where outlaws gathered to divide their spoils and conduct business away from the eyes of the law. Not the kind of place a man rode into alone and expected to ride out again. "Why separate you?" Nora's jaw tightened. "Because Landry isn't just a slaver. He's a land speculator. He forged those documents to steal our territory because there's water there. A spring that never runs dry, even in the worst droughts. Worth a fortune to the railroad companies pushing west." Will began to understand. He killed Samuel to eliminate the one person who could prove the forgery. Yes, and he took us to eliminate any legal heirs who might challenge his claim in court. As long as Samuel's daughters exist, we have standing to contest ownership. But if we're sold to buyers in Mexico or California, or worse, you disappear. No heirs, no challenge, clean title. Nora nodded. "He's not just killing us, Mr. Hartman. He's erasing our existence from legal record." Will sat back on his heels and let the full weight of the situation settle over him. This was not just a rescue mission. This was war against a man who had twisted the law itself into a weapon, a man with money and men and the patience to play a long game. And here sat William Hartman with $15 worth of cattle money spent on a gold watch, a handful of beaten girls, and a heart that might give out at any moment. "Samuel, what have you gotten me into?" Ruth spoke up suddenly. Her voice was small but clear in the dusty silence of the warehouse. "Are you going to help us?" Will looked at the 12-year-old girl, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, saw the shadow of Michael at that age, looking up at him with the same trust that Will had betrayed 1,000 times with his absences and his silences and his inability to be the father his son needed. "I gave up everything I owned for you six. Wouldn't make sense to stop halfway." He stood, ignoring the twinge in his chest where his heart was doing its irregular dance. There would be time for pain later, or there would not. Either way, the next few hours would determine whether any of them had a future at all. "Devil's Cut is 3 days' ride." "Yes, but," Nora hesitated, "Landry has 15 men. You're one old man with a bad heart and not enough bullets." "I know. How can you possibly?" "I can't fight 15 men in open combat, but I don't need to. I just need to get your sisters out." He pulled out his Winchester rifle and checked the action. Still smooth after all these years. He had maintained it out of habit long after he thought he would never use it again. Old soldiers never completely gave up their tools. "Tonight we rest. We move at sunset when the heat breaks. I know trails through the Badlands that most men have forgotten. We travel light and fast and quiet. And when we reach Devil's Cut..." Will thought of Samuel kneeling beside him in that desert 24 years ago, choosing mercy over practicality, choosing hope over calculation. "Then I do what your father did for me. I find a way." They left the warehouse as the sun bled red and orange across the western sky. Will led his horse by the reins with Ruth on its back because she was too weak to walk any distance. The other 5 girls followed in a loose line, moving through the shadows of Red Mesa's back streets like ghosts afraid of being seen. No one stopped them. No one even looked twice at the strange old man and his parade of battered Apache girls. In a town like Red Mesa, people had learned not to see things that might complicate their lives. Once they cleared the town limits, Will turned east toward the mountains. The trail he chose was an old one, barely visible beneath years of wind and weather. He had ridden it decades ago when he was young, and the territory was even wilder than it was now. Back then it had been a smuggler's path. Now it was simply forgotten. They walked through the cooling evening and into the moonlit night. Will kept the pace slow for the sake of the wounded girls, but his eyes never stopped scanning the darkness. Something felt wrong, a prickling at the back of his neck that he had learned to trust in 20 years of frontier survival. They were being followed. He spotted the first sign near midnight. Fresh hoofprints crossing their trail, heading in the same direction they were traveling. Too fresh to be coincidence, too careful to be casual travelers. Will said nothing to the girls. No point in adding fear to their already heavy burdens. But he adjusted their route slightly, leading them into rougher terrain where horses would leave clear tracks. If someone was following, he wanted to know exactly how many and how close. By dawn, he had his answer. 3 riders moving parallel to their course, making no move to intercept. Scouts, most likely. Landry's men keeping eyes on the merchandise that had escaped. Will called a halt in a narrow gully where rock walls would hide them from distant observation. The girls collapsed gratefully in the shade, while Will climbed a low rise to study their back trail. "What do you see?" Nora had followed him, moving quietly despite her injuries. 3 men, about a mile behind. They're not trying to catch us yet. Just watching. Waiting for reinforcements, probably. Or waiting for us to lead them somewhere useful. Will lowered himself from the rise. "We need to deal with them before we get anywhere near Devil's Cut." "How?" Will looked at Nora for a long moment, saw her father in the set of her jaw and the steady way she met his gaze. "Your father ever teach you to shoot?" "He taught me many things." "Good, because I can't do this alone." They made camp in the gully and let the girls rest while Will showed Nora how to handle his Colt Navy revolver. She learned quickly, her hands steady, even when the weight of the weapon made her wounded arms tremble. 6 shots, Will said. Make each one count. No wild firing. Pick your target and squeeze slow. And if I miss, then you move. Stay behind cover. Make them come to you. A patient defender beats a reckless attacker 9 times out of 10. Maya's coughing got worse as the day wore on. Will checked her wounds and felt his stomach clench. The infection was spreading. She was burning with fever, and the herbs he had were doing nothing to stop it. She needs a doctor, he told Nora quietly. Real medicine? We don't have that kind of time. Then we move faster. If we push too hard, she won't survive the journey. Nora's eyes glistened, but she did not let the tears fall. What would you have me choose? I'm not asking you to choose. I'm telling you the truth so you can make an informed decision. It was the way he had always approached problems. Lay out the facts, consider the options, accept the consequences. Catherine used to say it made him seem cold, but she had also understood that beneath the calculation was a heart that felt everything too deeply. We keep moving, Nora finally said. All of us together. If Maya dies, at least she dies with her sisters, not alone in some canyon waiting for vultures. Will nodded. It was what he would have chosen too. They moved out at sunset, pushing harder than before, but still careful to leave clear tracks for the scouts following them. Will wanted those 3 men to feel confident, to believe they were tracking a wounded old man and 6 helpless girls with no idea they were being watched. Just before midnight, Will called another halt in a cluster of boulders that formed a natural ambush point. The trail ahead narrowed between 2 rock walls. Anyone following would have to pass through single file. Here, he said to Nora, take your sisters into those rocks and stay hidden. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you. What are you going to do? Set a trap. Will spent the next hour preparing. He loosened rocks above the trail that could be pushed down with minimal effort. He positioned himself on a ledge where he could see the approach without being seen. He checked his rifle again and counted his ammunition. 12 rounds. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but hopefully enough for a short one. He waited. The 3 riders appeared just before dawn, their silhouettes emerging from gray light like shadows given form. They moved carefully, but not carefully enough. Will could see the laziness in their posture, the assumption that their quarry was unaware and helpless. He let the first rider pass beneath him, then the second. When the 3rd rider was directly below, Will pushed the loosened rocks. The horse screamed as stones crashed down around it. The rider flew from his saddle and hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs with an audible whoosh. His companions wheeled their horses, reaching for weapons, shouting confused warnings to each other. Will fired twice. The first shot took the second rider through the chest. He toppled backward off his horse and did not move again. The first rider spurred toward cover, but Will's second shot caught him in the leg. He screamed and fell, his horse bolting away into the desert. The third rider was struggling to his feet when Will slid down from his ledge. The man was young, maybe 25, with wild eyes and a hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. "Don't!" The young man froze. Up close, Will could see the fear beneath the bravado. This was not a hardened killer. This was a hired hand who had signed up for easy money and found himself staring at death. "Who sent you?" "Landry. Mr. Landry sent us to watch and report back." "Report what?" "Where you were taking them. He figured you'd head for Fort Defiance. He's got men there waiting." Will felt the information settle into place. Landry was not just defending his territory. He was playing chess, anticipating moves, positioning pieces. "What else?" The young man hesitated. Will cocked his rifle. "He knows about you." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Knows you're the soldier old Samuel saved. He said you'd come. Said men like you can't help themselves when they see that mark. He was counting on it." Will went cold. This was not chance. Landry had known that if he marked Samuel's daughters with the moonwing and displayed them publicly, someone who recognized the symbol might appear. Someone who felt obligated to intervene. It was a trap, and Will had walked right into it. "Where are the other 3 girls being held?" "Devil's Cut, like they told you. But Landry's there too now, with 12 men. And he's not planning to sell those girls tomorrow." "What is he planning?" The young man's face twisted with something that might have been shame. He's planning to wait. Wait for you to come, then kill you all and bury the bodies where no one will ever find them. No witnesses. No loose ends. Just clean title to land worth a fortune. Will stared at the young man for a long moment. The wounded rider was groaning somewhere behind them, but Will ignored him. Everything had changed. This was not a rescue mission anymore. It was an execution he had to prevent. How long until Landry expects to hear from you? Sunset today. If we don't report, he'll know something went wrong. Will checked the position of the sun. Maybe 10 hours. 10 hours to cover 2 days' worth of ground if they pushed hard. 10 hours to come up with a plan to defeat a dozen armed men who were waiting for him. Impossible. But then again, so was surviving an arrow wound alone in the desert. So was an Apache chief choosing to save an enemy soldier. So was finding meaning in life after everything that gave it meaning had been stripped away. Will had survived impossible before. Get up, you're coming with us. What? Why? Because you're going to tell me everything you know about Landry's operation. Every man, every gun, every weakness. And when we reach Devil's Cut, you're going to help me get those girls out. Landry will kill me. Probably, but if you don't help me, I'll definitely kill you right here, right now, so you have a choice. Certain death or probable death. Pick one. The young man, his name was Cole, he said later, stared at Will's face and saw something there that convinced him argument was useless. I'll help. Will nodded and turned away. Behind him, Nora emerged from the rocks with her sisters. Her eyes took in the scene, the bodies, the wounded rider, the captured scout, and she asked no questions. She simply began helping her sisters prepare to move. That was when Will felt it. The squeeze in his chest that he had been dreading. Not pain exactly, but a wrongness, a flutter where there should be a steady beat. His vision grayed at the edges and he stumbled. Will! Nora was at his side instantly, her hand gripping his arm. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're gray as ash. She pressed something into his hand. A small bottle. He recognized it. Digitalis. The medicine that kept his ruined heart beating something close to regularly. How did you? I found it in your saddlebag when I was looking for bandages. I know what it is. My father had a friend who needed the same medicine. She met his eyes with that unflinching broken arrow gaze. You knew you might not survive this. Will did not deny it. There seemed no point. I knew. But debts don't care about hearts. We'll carry you back to Red Mesa, get you to a doctor. No, 3 girls still waiting at Devil's Cut. We finish this. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Will could see her calculating options and outcomes just as he did. She was her father's daughter. All right, then we finish it together. But you lean on me when you need to. No more pretending you're fine when you're not. Will almost smiled. Deal. They moved out with Cole in tow and the weight of impossible odds pressing down on all of them. Behind them, the desert swallowed their tracks. Ahead, the mountains rose like the walls of a prison they were determined to enter. Somewhere in those mountains, Victor Landry was waiting with guns and men and a plan that accounted for everything except the stubbornness of an old man who had finally found something worth dying for. On the morning of the second day, they encountered 2 more travelers on the trail. An older Apache woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held decades of sorrow rode a paint mare that looked as worn as its rider. She stopped when she saw the moonwing mark on Nora's shoulder, her weathered face transforming with recognition and something deeper than hope. I am Rain Singing, she said, her voice carrying the careful formality of someone who had learned English from missionaries. I have been searching. Will's hand stayed near his rifle, but he did not draw. The woman was alone except for a young man who kept his distance, sitting his horse like someone who had not quite decided whether to run. Searching for what? Rain Singing's eyes moved across the 6 broken arrow sisters, cataloging their wounds and their exhaustion and the fact that they were still breathing. Then her gaze settled on Will with an intensity that made him feel transparent. For my son, a boy named Ethan Whitehawk, taken by Victor Landry's raiders 10 years ago when he was just 12 years old? Will looked at the young man who hung back on his horse. 22, perhaps 23, with the broad shoulders of someone who had done hard physical labor most of his life. His skin marked him as Apache, but his eyes held the flat affect of someone who had learned to feel nothing because feeling anything was too dangerous. That's him? Rain Singing nodded, but her face carried more grief than joy. I found him 3 days ago in a settlement near Canyon de Chelly. He was living under Landry's protection, working as an enforcer for the land claim operations. When I approached him, he did not remember me. When I sang the lullaby I sang every night of his childhood, something broke through. Or perhaps something broke entirely. I am not certain which. Ethan dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate in the way of someone who expected violence from any direction. He would not meet his mother's eyes. She says I'm her son. Maybe I am. The memories are there, but they feel like they belong to someone else. Like I'm watching another boy's life through dirty glass. Nora stepped forward before Will could speak. Her wounds still troubled her, but she moved with purpose. Victor Landry killed my father 4 weeks ago, shot him in the back while he rode home from seeking legal justice. Now he holds 3 of my sisters at Devil's Cut, planning to erase them from existence so he can steal our land without challenge. Ethan's jaw tightened. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite emotion, but the memory of emotion. Devil's Cut. I know that place. Landry uses it for transactions that need to stay invisible. Human cargo mostly, occasionally guns or documents that can't be moved through normal channels. You've been there? 3 times. Helped transport prisoners once. Landry wanted me to prove my loyalty after I questioned orders during a raid on a Navajo settlement. Rain Singing's face crumpled briefly before she forced it back into composure. Will recognized that expression. He had worn it himself when Michael left, that particular agony of loving someone who had been twisted into someone you could barely recognize. The prisoners, Will said carefully. What happened to them? Nothing good. Ethan finally looked at his mother, and whatever he saw in her face made him flinch. I did things I can't take back. Followed orders because questioning them meant joining the prisoners in their fate. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just telling you the truth so you know what kind of man is leading you. Will studied the young man, saw the war happening behind his eyes. Landry had taken a 12-year-old boy and spent a decade teaching him that survival meant cruelty, that loyalty meant abandoning everything that made you human. But something in Ethan had survived, some small part that could still feel shame. We're going to Devil's Cut, Will said. Tonight, if we can make the distance. We're going to get those 3 girls out, and we're going to make Victor Landry answer for what he's done. If you ride with us, there's no going back. Landry will know you betrayed him. I betrayed everything that mattered 10 years ago. This might be the first honest thing I've done since. Rain Singing reached out and touched her son's hand where it rested on his saddle. He did not pull away. Then we ride together, Will said. But I need to know everything about Devil's Cut. Layout, guard rotations, where Landry sleeps, where the prisoners are kept, everything. As they moved through the afternoon heat, Ethan provided information in the clipped, precise manner of someone giving a military briefing. Devil's Cut was a natural amphitheater carved into the Badlands, accessible by one main entrance but with several smaller passages that few people knew about. Landry kept 12 men there regularly, rotating them out every 2 weeks to prevent them from developing loyalties to each other instead of to him. He learned that from the military, Ethan explained. Spent time at Fort Sumner during the Navajo Long Walk. Saw how the Army broke tribal bonds by constantly moving people, never letting them establish roots or solidarity. He applies the same principles to his organization. Will felt cold hearing this. It transformed Landry from a simple villain into something more dangerous, a man who had studied oppression as a science and applied its lessons with brutal efficiency. The 3 girls, Will asked. Where would he keep them? There's a tent at the eastern edge of camp set apart from the others. That's where he holds high-value prisoners. He'll have 2 guards on it constantly, probably Apache boys he's raised like he raised me. They'll be the most dangerous because they have the most to prove. Cole, who had been silent since they broke camp, finally spoke up. His wounded leg made riding difficult, and pain had stripped away whatever bravado he had started with. He's right about the Apache guards. I've seen them work. They're harder than the white men because they're trying to prove they've left their people behind. Landry rewards that kind of demonstration. Nora's face showed nothing, but Will saw her hands tighten on the reins. She understood what Ethan and Cole were describing. A systematic destruction of identity, replacing family bonds with loyalty to a monster who had stolen their childhoods. They stopped at midday in a depression between two hills where scraggly mesquite provided minimal shade. Maya's fever had spiked again, and she could barely stay on her horse. Will helped her down and checked her wounds with hands that had tended too many dying soldiers to harbor illusions about what he was seeing. The infection had spread beyond what herbal remedies could address. Red lines radiated from the wounds on her back like poisoned rivers mapping her circulatory system. Her skin burned with heat, and when she tried to speak, only fragments came out between gasping breaths. "We need to stop," Anna said. At 16, she had taken on the role of caretaker for her sisters, always the first to notice when someone was struggling. She needs rest. Real rest, not just these brief stops where we pretend to recover before pushing on. If we stop long enough for her to recover, we won't reach the others in time, Nora said. Her voice carried no emotion, but Will heard the cost of that restraint. Landry expects his scouts to report by sunset. When they don't, he'll know we're coming. He might kill Mia and Sarah and Luna just to eliminate the witnesses. Or he might keep them alive as bait, Ethan said quietly. That's what I would do. Use them to draw you into a killing ground where he controls all the variables. That's exactly what he's doing, Will agreed. The question is whether we can turn his trap into ours. He laid Maya down in the shade and covered her with a blanket, despite the heat. Her body was consuming itself, trying to fight the infection. And the shivering that racked her came from internal fires, not external cold. Ruth appeared at his elbow with the canteen. The 12-year-old had barely spoken since they left Red Mesa, but her eyes tracked everything with an intelligence that reminded Will of Catherine in her youth. She's going to die, isn't she? Will did not insult her with comfortable lies. Without proper medicine, probably yes. Then we get her to proper medicine. After we get the others, we don't leave anyone behind. The simple certainty in her voice hit Will harder than any accusation could have. This child who had been tortured and sold and dragged through the desert still believed in salvation for everyone, still refused to accept that some situations forced you to choose between bad options and worse ones. We'll do everything we can, he said, and Ruth nodded, as if he had sworn an oath on sacred ground. They moved out again after an hour, but the pace had slowed. Maya could barely stay conscious, and Sarah had taken to riding beside her with one hand on her sister's arm, ready to catch her if she fell. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and even with frequent stops for water, everyone was showing signs of exhaustion. Will felt his own body betraying him in small ways. His vision would blur at the edges, then clear. His heart would skip beats, flutter, then resume its irregular rhythm. The digitalis helped, but he could feel the medicine losing its battle against the fundamental deterioration of muscle that had worked too hard for too long. Near sunset, Cole's horse came up lame. A stone had wedged between shoe and hoof, and when Will examined it, he found a crack in the hoof wall that would only worsen if they continued riding the animal hard. We walk from here, he decided. Rotate the girls between the remaining horses. Cole and I go on foot. You can barely stand, Nora observed. How are you going to walk 3 more miles? The same way I've done everything else, one step at a time until I can't anymore. But even that stubborn determination had limits. 2 miles from Devil's Cut, Will's heart stuttered and stopped. Not for long, perhaps 2 seconds, but long enough for the world to go gray and his legs to give out beneath him. He went down hard, his rifle clattering against stone. When he came to, Nora was leaning over him with the digitalis bottle, and fear naked on her face. How much of this have you taken today? Enough. How much? Will tried to remember but found his thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. 2 pills, maybe 3. The bottle's almost empty. How many pills were in here when we started? He did not answer because the answer would only confirm what she already knew. He was dying faster than planned, burning through medicine that was supposed to last weeks in a matter of days. Rain Singing appeared with a small leather pouch. I have herbs that might help, Not a cure, but they can strengthen the heart temporarily. Buy you a few more hours. Hours isn't enough. Hours is all any of us have. We use what we're given and make it matter. She prepared a tea from plants Will did not recognize, boiling water over a tiny fire shielded between rocks. The brew tasted like dirt and bitterness and something vaguely medicinal. Will drank it all. Within minutes, his heart settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. The gray edges of his vision pulled back. Strength returned to his limbs in small measures. "How long?" he asked. "Until midnight, perhaps. Maybe dawn if you're lucky. After that, the body decides for itself whether it wants to continue fighting." Will looked at the mountains ahead, where Devil's Cut waited. At the 6 Broken Arrow sisters who depended on him. At Cole and Ethan and Rain Singing, who had joined this impossible mission for their own reasons. At the debt he owed to a man who had saved his life 24 years ago and asked nothing in return except that Will become someone worth saving. "Then we make midnight count?" They reached the outskirts of Devil's Cut as the sun bled its last light across the Badlands. The canyon rose before them like a wound torn into the earth, red rock walls climbing toward a sky turning purple with approaching night. Will lay flat against warm stone and studied the terrain through eyes that had seen 100 battlefields. His chest ached with every breath, but he pushed the pain aside. Pain was a luxury he could not afford. Below, the canyon floor spread out in a rough circle, perhaps 200 yards across. 3 campfires flickered against gathering darkness, their light dancing across weathered faces of men who had chosen violence as profession. Will counted 12 figures moving between 4 canvas tents arranged in a loose semicircle. Horses stamped and snorted in a crude rope corral near the eastern wall. Supplies were stacked beneath a canvas tarp, and there, at the far end of camp, stood a tent set apart from the others with 2 wooden stakes driven into the ground at its entrance. "That's where they're keeping Mia and Sarah and Luna," Nora whispered beside him. Her breath was controlled and quiet, her movements careful despite wounds that still troubled her. 3 days of hard travel had not broken her. If anything, she seemed to have grown stronger, her grief and rage compressed into something cold and useful. "I see 2 guards on the tent. Another 2 patrolling the perimeter. The rest are around the center fire." Ethan crawled up beside them. "The canyon has one main entrance to the north where we're watching now. But there are 2 other possibilities," he pointed. "That crack in the eastern wall, barely wide enough for a single person, and that shadow on the southern face that might indicate a cave or tunnel. You've been here before. Do you know if the cave connects through?" "I never explored it, but Rain Singing might know. These were her people's hunting grounds before the wars." Will retreated from the overlook, and they made their way back to where the others waited in a sheltered hollow. The 6 Broken Arrow sisters sat together in fading light, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Maya lay on a blanket, her breathing shallow and rapid. Rain Singing tended to her with herbs and prayers, but even from a distance Will could see the effort was futile. The young woman was dying. Cole sat apart with his hands bound, a precaution Will had insisted on despite the scouts' cooperation. Trust had to be earned with more than words, especially when lives hung in the balance. "There's a cave system," Will said to Rain Singing, "on the southern face of Devil's Cut. Do you know if it connects through to the canyon floor?" The older woman rose from Maya's side, her face carved from stone, but her eyes holding depths of pain Will recognized. "I know those caves. My grandmother used them to hide from soldiers during the wars. There is a passage that runs beneath Devil's Cut and emerges near where the prisoner tent would be. The entrance is hidden behind a rockfall, but I can find it." "How long to navigate the caves?" "In darkness, with wounded people, perhaps 2 hours." Will did calculations in his head. 2 hours to position themselves. Then they had to time their move for when the guard rotation changed. Ethan had said shifts switched every 4 hours, the next change coming near midnight. 4 hours until they could act. 4 hours for Maya to hold on, for his own heart to keep beating, for Landry's men not to discover them first. "We use the caves," he decided. "Rain Singing leads us through. We emerge near the prisoner tent, deal with the guards quietly, get the girls out before anyone knows we're there. And if we can't do it quietly? Sarah asked. She had barely spoken since the slave market, but now her voice carried steel underneath the pain. If it turns into a fight? Then we fight. But we fight smart. Create confusion, use the terrain, make them afraid of shadows. 12 against 8 isn't good odds, but it's better than waiting for Landry to send reinforcements. Nora loaded her revolver with hands that did not shake. My father always said the difference between victory and defeat wasn't numbers or weapons. It was knowing what you were willing to sacrifice. Will thought about Catherine's watch, about the ranch he had sold, about the years he had wasted trying to find meaning in all the wrong places, about the debt he owed to a man who had chosen mercy when calculations said to choose otherwise. Then we make sure the sacrifice means something. They waited for full darkness. Will used the time to check weapons and plan contingencies, to give each person a role and make sure everyone understood what happened if things went wrong. He tried not to think about Maya's deteriorating condition or his own failing heart, or the fact that they were about to walk into an ambush that Landry had been preparing for days. Ruth approached him as he loaded his Winchester. "Mr. Hartman, when we get my sisters out, what happens to us after? Where do we go?" It was a fair question, one Will had been avoiding thinking about because it required imagining a future he might not live to see. "Fort Defiance. There's a judge there, man named Harrison. Honest as they come. He'll want to hear what happened, and he has the authority to investigate Landry's land fraud. Get your claim officially recognized. And after that? After that, you rebuild. Your father's land has that spring that never runs dry. You use it to start over, to create something Landry's greed couldn't destroy. Without you?" Will met her eyes, saw the understanding there. She knew he was dying, had probably known since she watched him collapse earlier. "Maybe without me, but I'll make sure you're safe first. That's the only debt that matters now." Ruth nodded slowly. Then she did something unexpected. She hugged him, wrapping her thin arms around his waist and holding on with surprising strength. Will stood frozen for a moment before his hand came up to rest gently on her head. "Thank you for coming back to Red Mesa," she whispered. "Thank you for not riding away." Will's throat closed. He could not speak, could only stand there while this 12-year-old girl who had every reason to trust no one chose to trust him anyway. When Ruth released him and returned to her sisters, Will found Ethan watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "You remind me of someone," Ethan said. "A man who found me after my first raid with Landry's crew. I was 13, had just helped burn a Navajo village. I was throwing up in the bushes, and this Apache elder sat down beside me. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he told me, 'You can become the weapon they're making you, or you can remember that you're human. The choice will be offered every day for the rest of your life, and every day you'll have to choose again.'" "Did you remember his name?" "Samuel Broken Arrow." Will closed his eyes. Of course. Of course Samuel had tried to save this boy too, had seen a child being twisted into something monstrous and offered him a different path. "He tried to save everyone," Will said. "Even people who didn't want saving. I wasn't ready to be saved then. Maybe I'm ready now." Midnight came cold and clear. The group assembled at the edge of the hollow. Will, Nora, Sarah, Anna, Claire, Ruth, Rain, singing, Ethan, and Cole, who had finally convinced Will to unbind his hands by providing detailed intelligence on Landry's habits. Maya stayed behind in the hollow, too weak to move. Leaving her felt like abandonment, but bringing her would guarantee failure. "I'll stay with her," Sarah said suddenly. "If she wakes up afraid, someone should be there." Will started to argue, but Nora shook her head. "She's right. Maya needs someone, and Sarah's wounds make her a liability in close combat anyway. 7 is still better than 6. Sarah's face showed relief mixed with shame. She was afraid. They were all afraid. But at least now her fear had productive purpose. Rain's singing led them south through terrain that seemed impassable until she showed them hidden paths between rocks. She moved with certainty of someone returning to beloved home, her feet finding purchase where Will saw only shadows and stone. They reached the cave entrance an hour before dawn. It gaped in the mountainside like a mouth frozen in silent scream, darkness spilling out like breath from some enormous sleeping creature. The passage narrows after the first chamber, Rain singing warned. We go single file. No torches until we're deep enough that light won't be seen from outside. Will nodded and turned to address the group. Stay close, stay quiet. If something goes wrong, don't panic. Fear kills faster than bullets in the dark. They entered the cave. The darkness was absolute, total, a physical thing that pressed against eyes and filled lungs with damp air that tasted of stone and centuries of silence. Will kept one hand on the cave wall and the other on Nora's shoulder ahead of him, trusting Rain, singing to lead them true. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing so tight they had to turn sideways and squeeze through gaps that scraped shoulders and caught at clothes. Will's chest burned with effort of controlled breathing. Every beat of his heart felt like hammer blow against ribs, and the herbs Rain singing had given him were losing their effect. He could feel the medicine's grip slipping, his body sliding back toward the edge of shutdown. Not yet, he told his treacherous heart. Not yet. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Rain singing called a halt. We're beneath the canyon floor now. The prisoner tent is directly above us, maybe 50 feet. There's a crack in the cave ceiling ahead that leads to the surface. Will struck a match. In its brief flare, he saw a chamber perhaps 20 feet across. Water dripped somewhere in darkness, creating irregular rhythm like heartbeat of the mountain itself. A narrow passage continued ahead, sloping upward toward gray hint of light. That crack leads close to the tent, Rain singing continued, but it's hidden by boulders. We can slip out unseen if we time it right. Guard rotation should be changing soon, Ethan said. When the new guards arrive, the old ones will be tired and distracted. That's our window. They crept forward, through the final passage. The gray light grew stronger, and with it came sounds. Voices, crackle of fire, a horse whinnying, the ordinary noises of a camp preparing for another day. Will reached the crack in canyon wall and pressed his eye to the gap. He could see the prisoner tent perhaps 30 yards away. 2 guards stood at its entrance, both young, both Apache. One of them was barely more than a boy, maybe 15 or 16, with eyes that darted nervously at every sound. Rain singing breathed beside him. I know the younger one. His name is Kyle Swiftbird. His mother was my cousin. She died in the raid that took Ethan. Will watched the young guard shift weight from foot to foot. There was no hardness in his face, no cruelty, just fear and confusion and desperate desire to please the only authority figure he had left. Can you reach him? I don't know. 10 years is a long time. He was 6 when they took him. If you could, it might make the difference between bloodshed and survival. Rain singing closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her face had changed. The warrior had softened into something else, a mother, an aunt, a keeper of memories. She began to sing. The sound was soft at first, barely a whisper. A melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. An old song, a Chiricahua lullaby that mothers had sung to their children for generations uncounted. Will watched Kyle Swiftbird freeze. The young guard's face went through transformation that was painful to witness. Confusion, recognition, memory flooding back through walls built to contain it. Rain. Singing sang on. The words spoke of stars and safety and arms that would always hold you close. The words spoke of home. Kyle began to shake. The older guard noticed something was wrong and reached for his companion's shoulder, but Kyle pulled away. He was staring at the crack in canyon wall where Rain singing's voice emerged, tears streaming down his face. Aunt, he whispered. Aunt Rain singing. The older guard went for his gun. Will moved. Will burst from the crack in the wall with speed that surprised even himself. Years of training took over, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. He caught the older guard before the man could shout, drove an elbow into his throat with precision learned in 100 close-quarters battles. The guard's windpipe collapsed. His gun clattered against stone. Will caught it before it could make noise. then drove his knife between the man's ribs with the cold efficiency of someone who had killed too many times to pretend it troubled him anymore. The guard went down without a sound. Kyle Swiftbird watched with wide eyes as Will lowered the body silently to the ground. The boy's hand had moved toward his own weapon but stopped halfway, frozen between two impossible choices. "I'm sorry," Will said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no other way. But Kyle was not looking at the dead guard. He was looking past Will to where Rain singing had emerged from the crack in the wall. The older woman opened her arms and Kyle walked into them like a child coming home from a nightmare, his body shaking with sobs he had probably been holding back for 10 years. Nora slipped past them into the prisoner tent. Will followed, his rifle ready, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that felt increasingly desperate. Inside, he found exactly what he had hoped for and feared. 3 young women bound to wooden stakes, their faces bruised but their eyes alive. Mia at 18 was the oldest, with Samuel's strong features and something fierce burning behind her exhaustion. Sarah at 15 and Luna at 13 completed the group. And there was a 4th prisoner. An older woman, perhaps 48 or 50, with silver streaks in her black hair and a face that bore marks of recent violence. A split lip that had scabbed over. A black eye that had faded to yellow-green. Rope burns on her wrists that spoke of weeks or months of captivity. She looked up as Nora entered, and her eyes went wide with recognition and disbelief, and something that might have been hope. "Nora?" "Oh, spirits, Nora." "Aunt Rachel." Nora dropped to her knees beside the woman. "We thought you were dead. Victor kept me alive, said I might be useful for negotiations if the legal challenges went badly." Rachel's voice was hoarse but strong underneath the damage. "He underestimated how stubborn your father's children would be." Will cut their bonds quickly, while keeping one ear tuned to sounds of the camp outside. So far no alarm had been raised, but that could change at any moment. "Can you walk?" "We can run if we have to," Mia said. Her voice carried the same steel as Nora's. These were Samuel Broken Arrow's daughters. They did not break easily. They slipped out of the tent into gray pre-dawn light. Kyle led the way now, his knowledge of camp layout proving invaluable as they threaded between shadows and avoided sightlines of sleeping guards. They were 50 feet from the cave entrance when everything went wrong. A shout rang out from across the camp. Then another. Then the sharp crack of a gunshot that echoed off canyon walls like thunder. "They found the body," Ethan said. "Run." They ran. But the camp was awake now, and men were pouring out of tents with guns in their hands and murder in their eyes. Bullets whined off stone as Will turned and fired. One man dropped. Another. But there were too many, and they were closing fast. "The cave!" Rain singing shouted. "Get to the cave!" Nora grabbed Luna and half-carried her toward the crack in the canyon wall. Mia and Sarah followed with Rachel between them, the older woman's legs barely supporting her weight. Anna and Claire brought up the rear, their faces showing terror, but also determination. Will stood his ground and fired until his rifle clicked empty. Then he drew his revolver and fired again. 2 more men fell, but the rest kept coming, their bullets chipping stone inches from his head. "Will!" Nora screamed. "Come on!" He turned to run, but something hit him hard in the shoulder. The impact spun him around and dropped him to one knee. Blood bloomed hot and wet against his shirt, and for a moment the world tilted sideways. Not now. Not yet. Strong hands grabbed him and pulled him through the crack just as a volley of shots shattered the stone where he had been standing. Inside the passage, chaos pressed bodies together in darkness. Frightened breathing. The smell of blood and fear. Behind them, Will could hear pursuit. Boots on stone, curses and commands. The sounds of men not accustomed to darkness, struggling to navigate terrain they did not know. "Move," he gasped. "They'll follow." They plunged deeper into the cave system with Rain, singing leading the way from memory. Behind them, Will could hear the pursuit growing closer. Torches flickered in the darkness, casting wild shadows on ancient stone. The passage narrowed and twisted and finally opened into a larger chamber. Will recognized it as the space they had passed through earlier, the one with the crack of gray light from the surface. "Seal the passage," he ordered. Anna and Claire worked frantically to pile loose rocks across the narrow entrance they had just come through. It would not stop determined pursuit, but it would slow them down. Will leaned against the cave wall and tried to assess his wound. The bullet had gone through the meat of his shoulder without hitting bone. Painful and bleeding heavily, but not immediately fatal. Not immediately, but added to his failing heart and the exhaustion that was rapidly consuming what little strength remained, it might as well have been a death sentence. "Let me see." Nora was beside him with strips of cloth torn from her own shirt. She worked quickly, packing the wound and binding it tight, while Will gritted his teeth against pain that felt distant and unimportant compared to the larger problem of keeping everyone alive. "We can't stay here," he said when she finished. "Landry will send men around to the main entrance. We'll be trapped between them." "Then where do we go?" Will thought of the canyon beyond the cave, of Devil's Hollow that locals had named for its treacherous terrain. A wider space with high walls and better defensive positions. If they could reach it and hold out long enough, maybe help would come. Maybe the message he had sent to Fort Defiance with Marcus, no, Cole, the captured scout, would bring soldiers in time. Maybe. A lot of maybes for a man with a bullet hole in his shoulder and a heart that was beating far too fast. Through the caves. Out the other side. We make our stand in Devil's Hollow. The passage ahead was narrow and twisting, but Rain Singing knew every turn. She led them through darkness so complete that Will could not see his own hand in front of his face. They moved by touch and trust, each person holding onto the one ahead, a chain of desperate humanity threading through the bowels of the earth. The underground river appeared without warning. One moment they were walking on dry stone, the next Will's boots splashed into water that rose quickly from ankle to knee to waist. The cold was shocking, brutal. His breath seized in his chest and his heart stuttered dangerously. Behind him, he heard Luna cry out in fear, heard Mia's voice steady and calm trying to reassure her youngest sister. "Keep moving," Rain Singing called back. "The water is only deep for 100 feet, then it shallows." They pushed forward through the current. Will could feel it tugging at his legs, trying to pull him off balance. The wounded were struggling. Luna was crying softly. Rachel was coughing, great racking sounds that echoed off unseen walls. And then Will heard it. A roar, distant but growing. The unmistakable sound of water coming fast. "Flash flood," he shouted. "Move! Everyone move now!" The group surged forward, but the current was strengthening with every passing second. Upstream somewhere, rain had fallen, and the runoff was funneling through these ancient passages with devastating force. Claire stumbled and went under. Will lunged and caught her arm, hauling her back to the surface. The effort nearly stopped his heart. Literally. He felt it skip and flutter, and for one terrible moment he thought this was the end, that he would drown in an underground river trying to save a 14-year-old girl he had known for less than a week. Keep going. Almost there. The water was chest-high now and rising. The roar was deafening. Will could feel the pressure wave coming, could sense the wall of water rushing toward them through the darkness like the fist of an angry god. "There!" Rain Singing screamed. "The far bank! Climb!" Will pushed Claire toward the voice and turned to grab Luna, who was flailing in the current. The girl's eyes were white with terror, but she clung to him as he dragged them both toward higher ground. They made it to the far bank just as the flood surge arrived. The water exploded through the passage behind them with a sound like the world ending. It crashed against walls and rebounded and filled the space where they had been standing only seconds before. If they had been caught in that surge, none of them would have survived. Will lay on cold stone, gasping for breath. His shoulder screamed with pain. His heart pounded erratically, skipping beats, racing, then slowing to a crawl that made his vision gray at the edges. But they were alive. He counted heads in the darkness, his chest tight with fear until he accounted for everyone. Nora, Mia, Sarah, Luna, Anna, Claire, Ruth, Rachel, Rain, Singing, Ethan, Kyle, Cole, all present, all breathing. "Is everyone all right?" Nora's voice was steady despite everything. Murmurs of assent rose from the darkness. Shaking voices, but alive voices. That was all that mattered. The passage behind us is flooded, Rain Singing said. Landry's men cannot follow this way. We have time. Time. Will almost laughed. Time was the one thing he did not have. He could feel his heart laboring in his chest, struggling to maintain rhythm after the stress of the escape and the freezing water and the gunshot wound that was bleeding through Nora's makeshift bandage. The digitalis was wearing off, and he had no more. The herbs Rain Singing had given him were exhausted. His body was running on nothing but willpower and the stubborn refusal to die before the job was finished. How far to Devil's Hollow? Perhaps half a mile through the upper passages. We'll emerge on the canyon floor. Then let's keep moving. Landry will not give up easily. He'll find another way around. They pressed on through the darkness. The passages rose steadily now, leaving the flooded chambers behind. Will moved on willpower alone, his body beyond exhaustion. His mind focused on one simple goal. Get them out, get them safe, then you can rest. Gray light appeared ahead. Then brighter light. Then suddenly, they were stumbling out of the mountainside into a wide canyon bathed in early morning sun. Devil's Hollow spread before them like an amphitheater carved by giants. Red rock walls rose 60 feet on all sides, their surfaces scarred by wind and water and countless years of patient erosion. The canyon floor was perhaps 300 yards across, dotted with boulders and scrub brush and scattered remains of ancient rockfalls. It was beautiful, it was defensible, and if they could not hold it, they would die here. Will surveyed the terrain with a soldier's eye. 3 entrances. The cave they had just exited on the south wall, a narrow gap in the eastern wall barely wide enough for a single person, and a wider passage to the north that led out toward the desert. Block the southern entrance, he ordered. Pile rocks, make it impassable. They cannot come through the flooded caves, so that leaves only 2 approaches to defend. The women moved to obey, while Will climbed a small rise to study the northern approach. In the distance, he could see dust rising, riders coming fast. Landry had found another way around. Will counted the dust clouds. 8, maybe 10 horses, most of Landry's remaining force. They would arrive within the hour. He climbed down and gathered the group around him. 12 faces looked back at him. 9 Broken Arrow sisters counting Rachel, plus Rain Singing, Ethan, Kyle, and Cole. 12 lives depending on an old man with a bad heart and not enough bullets. They're coming. We have maybe an hour before they reach us. Here's what we're going to do. He laid out the defense, positions behind boulders, fields of fire that overlapped, fallback points if the first line was breached. He had 8 people capable of fighting: Nora, Mia, Anna, Rain Singing, Ethan, Kyle, Cole, and himself. The younger girls and Rachel would shelter in the most protected positions. What about weapons? Mia asked. We have your guns and Kyle's rifle. That's not enough. We improvise. Over the next hour, they prepared. Rocks were gathered for throwing and for building barricades. Sharp stones were bound to sticks to make crude spears. Nora found a length of rope among the supplies they had carried and fashioned a trip line across the narrowest approach. Will watched them work and felt something shift in his chest. Not pain this time, something else. These were not helpless victims waiting to be saved. These were warriors, Samuel's legacy, fighters who would not go quietly into the darkness that men like Landry tried to force upon them. He thought of Michael. Thought of all the times he had been too busy fighting other people's wars to teach his son what it meant to stand for something, what it meant to defend those who could not defend themselves. Maybe it was not too late. Maybe if Will survived this, and survival seemed increasingly unlikely, he could find Michael and try again. Try to be the father he should have been all along. A lot of maybes. The dust clouds drew closer. Will positioned himself behind a large boulder near the northern entrance. From here he could see the approach clearly, and his rifle would command the narrow passage that any attacker would have to traverse. Nora crouched beside him. You should let me take this position, you're wounded. I'm also the best shot here, no offense. None taken, she paused. Will, if we don't survive this, We'll survive. But if we don't, I want you to know that my father was right about you. You did become different. You became the man he hoped you would be. Will felt his throat tighten. I'm just trying to pay my debts. No, you're doing more than that. You're showing us what honor looks like. My sisters will remember this for the rest of their lives, however long that may be. Before Will could respond, the first riders appeared at the canyon entrance. Victor Landry rode at their head. Will had never seen the man before, but he recognized him instantly. There was something in the way Landry carried himself. Arrogance that came from years of taking whatever he wanted from whoever was too weak to stop him. He was perhaps 45 with a face weathered by sun and cruelty, and eyes that held no more warmth than a rattlesnake's. He wore expensive clothes that seemed absurd in the desert heat, a statement that he could afford comfort while others suffered. Landry reined his horse to a stop just outside rifle range. Smart. He knew someone in the canyon could shoot. William Hartman, Landry's voice echoed off the canyon walls, smooth and educated and completely lacking in conscience. I have to admit, I didn't expect you to make it this far. An old man with a bad heart against my best trackers. I'm almost impressed. Will said nothing. Let Landry talk. Let him reveal his assumptions and his plans. Information was a weapon if you knew how to use it. Here's how this is going to go. You send out the girls and I let you ride away. Simple as that. No more killing, no more running. Just a business transaction between reasonable men. You killed Samuel Broken Arrow, shot him in the back on a road where he was trying to seek legal justice. There's nothing reasonable about you. Landry shrugged, the gesture casual, as if they were discussing the weather. Samuel was a complication. I removed him. That's business in this territory. You know how it works. You were a soldier. You've removed complications yourself. The words hit Will harder than he wanted to admit because they were true. In his years of service, he had done things that haunted him still. Followed orders he knew were wrong. Looked away when cruelty was committed in the name of duty. Convinced himself that survival required moral compromise, that the mission justified methods. The difference between us, Landry, is that I learned from my sins. You revel in yours. Pretty words, but words won't stop bullets. I have 10 men with me. You have what? A handful of wounded women and a bad heart. This ends one way, old man. The only question is how much blood gets spilled before you accept it. Will raised his rifle and sighted on Landry's chest. At this range, with this weapon, he could end the man right now. Remove the head, and the body might fall apart. But Landry's men had their own rifles raised, and they were spread out in defensive positions. Even if Will killed Landry, he would be dead a second later, and then nothing would stand between these predators and their prey. I'll give you one chance, Will said, his voice carrying across the distance. Right away. Tell whoever sent you that the Broken Arrow girls are under my protection. Come back, and I'll kill every one of you. Landry laughed. It was an ugly sound, wet and cruel like something diseased. I appreciate the offer, old man, but I have too much invested in this to walk away now. That land is worth a fortune. Those girls are the only obstacle to claiming it. I'm not leaving without them. He turned to his men and raised his hand. Kill the old man. Take the girls alive. We leave in 1 hour. The riders charged. Will fired. The lead rider tumbled from his saddle as Will's bullet caught him square in the chest. The others scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and scrub as more shots rang out from the canyon. Kyle was firing from a position on the eastern wall, his shots careful and measured. Rain Singing had her bow, the arrows she had fashioned from bent wood and sharpened stone, finding targets with surprising accuracy. Nora and her sisters threw rocks from behind their barricades, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. For a few chaotic minutes, it seemed like they might hold. The narrow approach limited how many men could attack at once, and the defenders knew the terrain far better than the attackers. Then Landry sent a group around to the eastern gap. Will saw them too late. 3 men slipping through the narrow passage that he had thought too small to be a real threat. They emerged behind the defender's position and opened fire. Anna screamed as a bullet grazed her arm. Mia dove for cover, pulling Luna down with her. The careful defensive positions fell apart as everyone scrambled to respond to the threat from behind. Will left his position and ran toward the breach. His shoulders screamed with every step. His heart pounded erratically, missing beats, racing, threatening to stop entirely. But there was no one else. No one between those three men and the youngest Broken Arrow sisters who cowered behind inadequate shelter. He reached the eastern gap just as the third attacker was coming through. The man's eyes went wide as Will appeared before him, like death itself made flesh. There was no time for fancy gunwork. Will drove his knife into the man's gut and shoved him backward into his companions. The second attacker stumbled over the falling body. Will shot him at point-blank range, the muzzle flash burning skin, the report deafening in the confined space. The third man tried to retreat, but Nora was there now with a rock in her hand. She brought it down on his skull with a crack that echoed off canyon walls. The man crumpled, and whether he was dead or merely unconscious, Will neither knew nor cared. 3 down, 7 to go. But Will could not stand. His legs gave out and he collapsed against the canyon wall, his back scraping stone as he slid to sitting position. His heart was doing something terrifying in his chest, stopping and starting, fluttering like a bird trapped in a cage that was rapidly closing. Will! Nora was beside him, her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. Will! Stay with me! He tried to speak, but no words came. The world was going gray at the edges, sounds fading to a distant murmur. He could hear Catherine calling his name, her voice gentle and sad and infinitely loving. Hold on just a little longer. There's still work to do. With an effort that cost him everything, he pulled himself back from the edge, forced his eyes to focus, forced his heart to beat. Digitalis, he gasped, in my saddlebag, the horse. Nora's eyes went to the cave entrance where Will's horse waited with the others. 50 feet of open ground between them and the medicine that might save his life. I'll get it. No, too dangerous. Landry's men, but she was already running. Will watched her sprint across the canyon floor, watched bullets kick up dust around her feet, watched her reach the horses and tear through his saddlebag with desperate hands. Watched her find the bottle. Empty now, he had forgotten. He had used the last pills yesterday, and turned to run back. Watched a rider emerge from cover and aim his rifle at her exposed back. Will raised his revolver. His hand shook so badly he could barely aim. His vision was blurring. His heart was stopping. He fired. The rider jerked and fell from his horse. Nora reached Will and pressed the empty bottle into his hands, her face stricken when she realized there was nothing left. There has to be something. Rain singing, she had herbs. Use them. All gone. Nora's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Then what do we do? Will looked at her. This fierce young woman who had endured torture and slavery and a desperate flight through the desert, who had learned to shoot and fight and lead when leadership was thrust upon her. Samuel's daughter in every way that mattered. You keep fighting. You get your sisters out. You finish this. Not without you. Especially without me. Will managed something that might have been a smile. I'm the old man with the bad heart, remember? I was always going to slow you down eventually. He pushed himself upright using the canyon wall for support. Every movement felt like lifting mountains, but he forced his body to obey. There were still enemies in the canyon. Still work to do. How many left? 7, including Landry. They've pulled back to regroup. 7. Better odds than before, but still not good. Not when Will could barely stand and half his fighters were wounded and exhausted. We need a new plan, something they won't expect. Ethan appeared at his elbow, the young man's face showing strain but also something else. Determination. Purpose. The look of someone who had finally chosen which side of the line he would stand on. I know how Landry thinks. He'll wait now, try to starve us out or wear us down. He won't risk more direct assaults after losing 6 men. Then we don't give him time to wait. We force his hand. How? Will thought of his conversation with Cole days ago, of the information the captured scout had provided about Landry's organization, about men who followed out of fear rather than loyalty, about the fragility of power built on terror instead of trust. We break his hold on the men who follow him, show them that Landry isn't invincible, that there's another path. Kyle stepped forward. The young man who had been raised by Landry, taught to see his own people as enemies, had spent the last hours fighting against everything he had been conditioned to believe. I'll go. I'll talk to them. Some of those men knew me before when I was still being broken in. They might listen. Landry will kill you. Maybe. But if there's a chance to save even one other person from what happened to me, he looked at Rain singing, his aunt who had sung him back to himself. Then it's worth the risk. Will studied Kyle's face and saw echoes of Samuel in the young man's resolve. The capacity for courage, even when courage seemed suicidal. The willingness to sacrifice for a cause larger than survival. You don't go alone. Ethan goes with you. Two voices are stronger than one. And I go, Cole added quietly. The captured scout had been silent since the fighting started, but now he stepped forward. I rode with those men. They might trust me more than Apache boys Landry twisted into weapons. Will wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too dangerous, wanted to keep every fighter close because they could not afford losses. But he had learned something during these desperate days with the Broken Arrow sisters. Sometimes the only way forward was through impossible choices. At dusk, we send them with a white flag when shadows are long and men are tired and starting to think about mortality. We give Landry's followers a choice between serving a monster and walking away. And when Landry makes his move, Nora asked, because he will. Then we're ready. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for what would come. Will knew this was likely his last battle, that his heart was running on fumes and stubbornness, and would fail completely before much longer. But he could still position defenders, could still share what he had learned in 20 years of warfare, could still make sure that when he fell, the people he had tried to protect might survive what followed. As sunset approached, he found himself sitting with Ruth on a flat rock overlooking the canyon. The 12-year-old girl had been quiet most of the day, but now she looked at Will with eyes far too old for her age. You're going to die soon, aren't you? Will did not insult her with comfortable lies. Probably, yes. Will it hurt? I don't know. I hope not. Ruth was quiet for a moment, watching the sky turn orange and purple as the sun descended toward the horizon. My father used to say that death wasn't the end, that we continue in the memories of people we loved and the ripples we leave behind in the world. Your father was a wise man. He also said that the most important thing wasn't how long you lived, but what you did with the time you had. She turned to look at Will directly. I think you've done good things with your time, especially these last few days. Will felt something break open in his chest, not his failing heart, but something deeper. Some wall he had built around his grief and his regret, and his conviction that he had wasted his life on violence that solved nothing and left only scars. Thank you, Ruth. That means more than you know. She reached over and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his scarred ones. They sat that way as darkness fell, an old man and a young girl watching the last light fade from the sky, both of them knowing that tomorrow might bring endings but also transformations. Death but also legacy, the completion of debts that were never really debts at all. Just gifts passed forward through time. When full darkness came, Kyle and Ethan and Cole walked out of the canyon with a white flag made from torn cloth. They moved slowly across open ground toward Landry's camp, their forms visible in moonlight that painted everything silver and shadow. Will watched through his rifle sights, his finger resting on the trigger, ready to provide covering fire if things went wrong. The three men reached the camp. He could see figures gathering around them, could see gestures and pointing, could not hear words but could imagine them. Listen to us. We have something to tell you. Something about the man you follow. The truth about Victor Landry. Minutes passed. Will's heart pounded steadily in his chest, each beat a small victory against the darkness that kept trying to claim him. Every breath felt like a gift he had not earned but was grateful for anyway. Then he saw it. A commotion in the camp, raised voices, someone shoving someone else. The beginning of conflict as Kyle's words found fertile ground in men who were tired and frightened and starting to question whether Victor Landry was worth dying for. And then Landry emerged from his tent with a shotgun in his hands and murder in his eyes. Will raised his rifle, his heart rate spiking, his vision tunneling down to that one figure crossing the camp with weapon raised. The final battle was about to begin. Victor Landry moved like a rattlesnake coiled to strike. Will watched through his rifle sights as the man crossed the camp with that shotgun held ready, his face twisted into something barely human. 10 years of building an empire on broken children and stolen land. 10 years of believing himself untouchable, above consequence, exempt from the basic arithmetic of justice. And now, 3 of his own soldiers stood in the firelight telling the others exactly what kind of monster they served. Will could see the moment Landry decided to kill them. It was in the set of his shoulders, the way his grip shifted on the shotgun, the cold calculation replacing rage as he realized that dead men tell no tales and frightened men follow the one holding the biggest gun. Will fired. The bullet caught Landry in the right arm and spun him sideways. The shotgun discharged into the dirt, sending up a spray of dust and rock. Landry screamed, more from fury than pain, and dove behind a supply wagon. Everything happened at once. 3 of Landry's men scattered for cover, their loyalty apparently not strong enough to survive the revelations Kyle and Ethan and Cole had shared. 2 others raised their rifles toward the canyon entrance, where Will's muzzle flash had betrayed his position. Kyle tackled Cole to the ground as bullets whined overhead. Ethan rolled behind a barrel, his own rifle coming up to return fire. "Now!" Will shouted. "Everyone move now!" The Broken Arrow sisters erupted from their hiding positions. Nora led the charge with a rifle she had taken from one of the dead raiders. Mia followed with Rain Singing's bow. Even Anna joined the assault despite her wounded arm, her face showing determination that transcended pain. Will pushed himself upright and advanced on the camp. His shoulders screamed with every step. His heart pounded erratically against his ribs, missing beats, racing, threatening to stop entirely. But he had bullets left and enemies to face and people counting on him to see this through. One of Landry's men rose from behind a rock with his pistol aimed at Nora. Will shot him without breaking stride. Another tried to mount a horse and flee. Mia's arrow, Rain, Singing had given her the bow, caught him between the shoulder blades, and he tumbled into the dust. The camp had become a maelstrom of gunfire and shouting and desperate violence. Will lost track of individuals in the chaos. He fired at movement, ducked behind cover when bullets came his way, kept pushing forward toward the wagon where Landry had taken shelter. He found Kyle and Cole crouched behind an overturned water barrel. Both young men were bleeding from minor wounds, but their eyes were clear and focused. "Where is he?" Kyle pointed toward the far edge of camp, where horses stamped nervously at their picket line. "He ran for the horses. I think he's trying to escape." Will looked and saw it. A figure limping through shadows, one arm hanging useless, the other dragging a rifle. Victor Landry was indeed running. The master manipulator had finally met a situation he could not control, and his response was to abandon everything he had built rather than face the consequences. Will would not let that happen. He ran. His body protested every step. His shoulder wound had reopened and blood soaked through Nora's bandages. His heart stuttered and jumped like a wild thing trying to escape his chest. But he ran because Samuel Broken Arrow deserved justice. Because Nora and her sisters deserved closure. Because some debts could only be paid in full. He caught Landry at the picket line. The man was struggling to mount a horse one-handed when Will's voice stopped him cold. "Landry." Victor Landry turned slowly. In the dim light, his face looked ancient, all the cruelty and cunning stripped away to reveal something pathetic underneath. A small man who had built himself up by tearing others down. A coward who preyed on children because adults might fight back. "Hartman." Landry tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "You look terrible, old man. How's that heart holding up?" "Better than yours will be." Landry glanced at the rifle in Will's hands, then at his own weapon lying in the dirt where he had dropped it trying to mount the horse. Calculation flickered in his eyes. Always calculating. Always looking for an angle. "We can make a deal. I have money hidden. Enough to buy that ranch of yours 10 times over. Let me go and I'll tell you where it is. You can retire in comfort. Give those Indian girls whatever they need to start over." "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want? Revenge? Justice? Landry laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. There's no justice in this territory, Hartman. Only survival. Only power. I thought you were a soldier. I thought you understood that. I was a soldier. I followed orders I should have questioned. I did things that still haunt me. But I learned something your kind never will. Will raised his rifle and sighted on Landry's chest. His hands trembled, but his aim was true. I learned that a man is defined not by what he does when someone is watching, but by what he does when no one is watching. Landry's hand moved toward his belt, where a small pistol was tucked. Will saw the motion and adjusted his aim. Don't. But Landry was past listening, past calculating. He had spent his whole life taking what he wanted by force, and he would die the same way. His hand closed on the pistol grip and started to draw. Will fired. The bullet caught Landry's center mass and knocked him backward against the horse. He slid down the animal's flank and collapsed in the dust, the pistol falling from his fingers unfired. Will walked forward and stood over the man who had killed Samuel Broken Arrow, who had stolen children from their families and twisted them into weapons, who had built an empire on suffering and called it business. Landry looked up at him with eyes already glazing. Blood bubbled at his lips when he tried to speak. You think you've won? The words came out wet and broken. There are others, like me. You can't stop them all. Maybe not, but I stopped you. Landry's mouth worked silently. He seemed to be trying to say something else, something defiant or threatening or simply mean. But the words never came. His eyes went empty, and he was gone. Will stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he had done settle over him like a physical thing. He had killed before, too many times during the wars, too many faces that still visited him in dreams. But this felt different. This was not the chaos of battle or the fog of following orders. This was justice delivered with full understanding of what it meant and what it cost. The sounds of fighting had faded behind him. The night was quiet except for the nervous shuffling of horses and the distant call of an owl. It was over. Will turned and walked back toward the canyon. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. His heart was doing something strange and slow in his chest, each beat requiring conscious effort as if he had to remind his body how to continue functioning. But he kept walking because there were people waiting for him. People who needed to know they were finally safe. Nora met him at the edge of the firelight. Her face was streaked with dirt and blood, not all of it hers, but her eyes shone with something he had not seen there before. Peace, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Landry? Dead. She nodded slowly. Then she did something that surprised them both. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce embrace. Thank you for everything. Will held her awkwardly. He was not used to being held. Catherine had been the last person to embrace him like this, and that was 5 years and a lifetime ago. But something in him cracked open at Nora's touch. Some wall he had built around his grief and his regret and his conviction that he had wasted his life. Your father saved my life. I was just returning the favor. You did more than that. You saved his legacy. You saved us. They stood there in the flickering firelight while the others gathered around. 9 Broken Arrow women, counting Rachel, who had survived weeks of captivity with her spirit unbroken. Rain singing, and her recovered son Ethan. Kyle Swiftbird, who had remembered his true name after 10 years of darkness. All of them alive. All of them free. Will looked at their faces and felt something he had not felt in years. Purpose, meaning, the sense that his life had been worth something after all. Then his heart gave a strange flutter and the world tilted sideways. Will! Nora's voice seemed to come from very far away. He tried to answer, but his legs gave out. The ground rushed up to meet him and everything went dark. When Will woke, he was lying on a blanket near a fire. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. Someone had bandaged his wounds and cleaned the blood from his face. He felt weak as water, hollowed out, as if everything that had sustained him through the desperate days of rescue and flight and battle had finally burned away, leaving only ash. But his heart was beating. Steadily. For now. Nora's face appeared above him. You collapsed. Your heart stopped for almost a minute. Rain's singing brought you back with some kind of herb mixture I've never seen before, but she says it's only temporary. You need a doctor. Real medicine. Will tried to sit up and managed it on the third attempt. His body felt like it had been beaten with hammers, but he was alive. He had not expected to be. How long was I out? A few hours, the fighting is over. Landry's men who survived have scattered. Ethan convinced 2 of them to surrender peacefully. They're tied up waiting for the authorities. Will looked around the camp. Supplies had been gathered. Horses had been calmed and collected. The Broken Arrow sisters were resting together near another fire, their faces peaceful in sleep for perhaps the first time in weeks. You organized all this. Someone had to. You were busy dying. Will almost smiled at that. Almost. I seem to be making a habit of it. Then stop. Nora's voice cracked slightly, and he realized she was barely holding herself together. Stop trying to die. We need you, Will. Not just for protection. We need you because you're the only one who understands what we've been through. The only one who knew my father. The only one who can help us figure out what comes next. Will looked at this young woman who had lost her father and her home and nearly her life, who had been beaten and sold and hung upside down in a slave market, who had fought back against impossible odds and emerged stronger than she had any right to be. Samuel would be so proud of her. There's a judge at Fort Defiance. His name is Harrison, an honest man, which is rarer than it should be in this territory. He'll want to hear what happened here, the forged land documents, the murders, all of it. And after that? After that, you rebuild. Your father's land has that spring that never runs dry. You use it to start over, to create something Landry's greed couldn't destroy. Will paused, the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him. I have a ranch, about 100 miles east of here. Good land, water rights, buildings that need repair but could be made useful again. You're going back to it? No. Will took a breath that felt like lifting mountains. I'm giving it away. Nora stared at him. What? My wife Catherine built that ranch with me. We raised our son there. It holds every good memory I have from the last 30 years. Will felt his throat tighten with emotion he had not allowed himself to feel since Catherine's death. But Catherine is dead. My son Michael wants nothing to do with me, and I'm dying. The ranch doesn't need a ghost haunting it. It needs life. Purpose. He met Nora's eyes, saw her father's strength reflected there. I want to deed the ranch to the Chiricahua people, specifically as a school. A place where your children can learn to navigate this new world while keeping your traditions alive. Where they can be educated in English and mathematics and law, all the tools they'll need to defend themselves against men like Landry, while also learning the songs and ceremonies and wisdom that your people have carried for generations. Nora was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was thick with tears she would not let fall. My father dreamed of something like this. A place where our people could learn the white man's ways without losing our own. He said it was the only way we would survive what was coming. Samuel was a wise man. He was. Nora met Will's eyes and he saw decision crystallizing there. And he would want us to honor his memory by building something that lasts, not by fighting endless wars we cannot win. Rain singing approached, her weathered face showing approval. A school is a good legacy. Better than revenge, better than land held by force. Knowledge is the only weapon that cannot be taken away. Over the next hour, they made plans. It would take time, months probably, to establish the legal framework, to recruit teachers, to convert the ranch buildings into classrooms. But for the first time since Catherine's death, Will felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Not hope for himself. His time was measured in days now, perhaps weeks if he was lucky. But hope for what he could leave behind. Hope that the debt he owed to Samuel Broken Arrow might be paid not just in rescuing 9 daughters, but in creating something that would serve hundreds of children for generations to come. As dawn broke over the canyon, painting the red rock walls gold and crimson, they prepared to leave. Maya was still unconscious, her fever raging, despite Rain Singing's best efforts. They fashioned a travois to carry her, knowing that every hour they delayed getting her to Fort Defiance reduced her chances of survival. Cole approached Will as they were saddling horses. The young scout looked different than he had 3 days ago, less sure of himself, more raw, as if the violence he had witnessed had stripped away protective layers he had not known he was wearing. "I'm riding to Fort Defiance ahead of you. Fastest horse, straight through. I'll find Judge Harrison and tell him everything, about Landry, the forged documents, the murders. I'll bring help back." "Why should I trust you?" Cole met his eyes without flinching. "Because I saw what you did for those girls. Because I've been riding with men like Landry my whole adult life and I'm tired of being ashamed of what I see in the mirror. Because you gave me a choice between certain death and probable death, and I chose probable. Now I'm choosing something else." Will studied the young man's face and saw sincerity there, but also understanding that sincerity alone meant nothing without action to back it up. "Judge Harrison is in the territorial courthouse. Tell him William Hartman sent you. Tell him I'm calling in a favor from Fort Sumner in 63. He'll know what that means." Cole nodded and swung into his saddle. Within moments, he was galloping north toward Fort Defiance, riding low and fast like a man pursued by demons, or perhaps trying to outrun them. The rest of the group moved out more slowly, their pace limited by Maya's condition and the exhaustion that had settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. Will rode near the back, conserving his strength, trying not to think about how much each mile cost him. His heart was failing. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had spent 52 years learning to read his own body's signals. The digitalis was gone. Rain Singing's herbs had bought him hours, maybe a day, but they were not a cure, just a delay, a temporary reprieve from the inevitable. Nora rode beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. She did not try to make conversation or offer false comfort. She simply stayed close, ready to catch him if he fell, ready to take his weight when his body finally decided it had carried enough. On the second day of travel, they encountered a patrol from Fort Defiance. Cole had made it through, had delivered his message, and Judge Harrison had dispatched soldiers immediately. A doctor rode with them, a severe woman named Dr. Patricia Morgan, who took one look at Maya's condition and immediately set to work with medicines and instruments that represented civilization's best weapons against death. "She'll live," Dr. Morgan pronounced after an hour of treatment. "Barely. Another day and we would have been too late. As it is, she'll need weeks of rest and careful monitoring, but the infection is responding to treatment." Will felt something ease in his chest. Not the physical pain, but the weight of responsibility he had been carrying. Maya would survive. They had gotten her here in time. Dr. Morgan turned her attention to Will next, and her expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to alarm. "When did you last take digitalis?" 3 days ago. Ran out." She pressed her stethoscope to his chest and listened for a long moment, her face growing more grave with each passing second. "Your heart is in atrial fibrillation, severely irregular rhythm, multiple skipped beats, overall weakness in the muscle tissue itself. Combined with blood loss from your shoulder wound and general exhaustion?" She trailed off, but Will heard what she was not saying. "How long?" "Days. Maybe a week with proper rest and medication, but given the damage I'm seeing, even that might be optimistic." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartman. If you had come to me 6 months ago, there might have been more options. Now," she shook her head. Will nodded. It was what he had expected. What he had known since he bought those 6 girls from the slave market and gave up everything he owned to do it. Then, we make the days count. They reached Fort Defiance late on the 3rd day. The military outpost turned territorial headquarters rose from the desert like a promise of civilization, its walls and buildings suggesting that law and order could exist even in the harsh emptiness of the Southwest. Judge Harrison received them in his chambers the following morning. He was a man of perhaps 65 with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Will had known him briefly during the wars, had respected him as one of the few officers who treated both sides as human beings, deserving of basic dignity. Harrison listened to their story without interruption. He examined the forged documents they had recovered from Landry's camp, took sworn testimony from Nora and her sisters, and Ethan and Kyle and Cole, studied the evidence with the care of someone who understood that truth was a fragile thing, easily destroyed by carelessness or bias. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long time, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. This is a serious matter. Land fraud, murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, human trafficking. If what you've told me is true, and I believe it is, then Victor Landry was running a criminal enterprise that violated half the laws on the books. It's all true, Will said. Every word. I believe you, Mr. Hartman. The problem is proof. Landry is dead. His organization is scattered. His victims are… He paused delicately. Not the most credible witnesses in the eyes of certain courts. Nora stiffened. Because we're Apache. Because there are men in this territory who profit from the current state of affairs. Men who would prefer that land claims remain murky and justice remain selective. Harrison stood and walked to his window. I'm not one of those men, but I'm also not naive enough to think that truth alone will carry the day. Then what do we do? Harrison returned to his desk and pulled out a map of the territory. The Broken Arrow land claim is actually quite strong. Chief Samuel filed all the proper paperwork years ago, got it witnessed and notarized and registered with the territorial office. He pointed to a section of the map. This is yours, legally and properly yours. Landry's forgeries were clever, but they relied on people not looking too closely. He rolled up the map with decision. I'll open an official investigation into Landry's activities. Subpoena records, interview witnesses, build a case that even the most biased court cannot ignore. It will take time, months probably, but if you're patient, the land will be restored to you. We've been patient for generations, Judge. We can be patient a little longer. Harrison nodded. Then his eyes moved to Will, and something in his expression softened. And what about you, Hartman? What are your plans? Will had been thinking about that question since the night in Devil's Hollow, since the moment he collapsed and realized his time was running out faster than he had wanted to admit. I have a ranch. Good land about 100 miles east. I'm deeding it to the Chiricahua people to be used as a school. He explained his vision. A place where Apache children could learn English and law and mathematics while also maintaining their cultural traditions, where education became a bridge between worlds rather than a weapon used to destroy identity. Harrison listened with growing interest. That's ambitious, noble even. But a school needs teachers, administrators, someone to run it. I know. I was hoping you might help me find those people. Help establish the legal framework to protect it from future challenges. I can do that. Harrison made notes on a piece of paper. I'll draw up the trust documents, establish a board of trustees, make sure the property serves its intended purpose for generations to come. It's a good legacy, Hartman. Better than most men leave behind. Will felt exhausted suddenly, as if the effort of planning and hoping and imagining a future he would not live to see had consumed whatever reserves he had left. Dr. Morgan appeared in the doorway. Mr. Hartman needs to rest. His heart cannot take much more strain. Will wanted to argue, but found he lacked the energy. He let Nora help him back to the small room the fort had provided, let her ease him down onto a bed that felt impossibly soft after weeks of sleeping on hard ground. Sleep, she said. We'll handle the rest of the arrangements. You've done enough. But Will could not sleep. His mind kept circling back to one unresolved piece. Michael. His son, who had left 5 years ago without goodbye, who had every reason to hate the father who had been absent even when present, who had chosen duty over family so many times that family had finally given up waiting. Will had written a letter to Michael shortly after arriving at Fort Defiance. A long letter that said everything he should have said years ago. The apologies he owed. The explanations he could not adequately give. The simple truth that he loved his son and wanted nothing more than to see him again before the end. He did not expect a response. But as October faded into November and Will's health continued to deteriorate, part of him could not stop hoping. The school project moved forward with surprising speed. Judge Harrison proved to be a man who kept his word, and within weeks he had established the legal framework, recruited 3 teachers from the missionary schools, and begun the process of converting Will's ranch buildings into functional classrooms. Nora took charge of the day-to-day planning with a competence that reminded Will powerfully of Samuel. She negotiated with territorial officials who were suspicious of the whole enterprise, coordinated supplies and construction, balanced the competing needs of maintaining Chiricahua traditions, while teaching skills that would help her people survive in a world increasingly dominated by white American culture. Her sisters each found their roles. Maya, recovered from her infection, became the school's nurse. Anna discovered a gift for teaching young children, her quiet patience perfect for students just beginning their education. Claire and Ruth helped where they could, growing into their responsibilities with each passing week. Rachel, their aunt, who had survived weeks of captivity, became the keeper of traditions. She taught students the old songs and ceremonies that had been passed down through generations of Chiricahua people, ensuring that education did not mean erasure. Rain singing came to help as well, bringing Ethan with her. The young man was still healing from 10 years under Landry's influence, but day by day Will could see him becoming more like the person he was meant to be, less guarded, less afraid, willing to laugh occasionally and even to hope. Michael arrived on a cool October morning with the first hints of winter in the air. Will was sitting on the porch of the main ranch house, now converted into the school's primary building, watching students arrive for their daily lessons. He had grown too weak to do much else, his body betraying him in ways both large and small, but every morning he sat in that chair and watched the future take shape before his eyes. The rider appeared on the road leading to the ranch, and Will's heart gave a painful lurch. He knew that silhouette, would have recognized it anywhere, despite 5 years of separation. His son had grown into a man of 28 with Catherine's eyes and Will's stubborn jaw, with the bearing of someone who had found purpose in life even if that purpose had led him far from home. Michael dismounted slowly and stood at the edge of the porch, looking at his father with an expression that held years of anger and grief, and something else. Something that might have been hope. "You look terrible." Will felt a laugh bubble up in his chest, weak but genuine. "I know." "The letter you sent." Michael's voice was rough, unpracticed at emotion after years of careful control. "Nora Broken Arrow added a note of her own. She told me what you did. What you risked. She had no right to do that. She had every right. Someone needed to tell me that my father wasn't the man I thought he was." Will felt tears threatening, but he forced them back. There would be time for tears later, or there would not. Either way, he needed to say what mattered while he still could. "I was that man, Michael. For a long time, I was exactly the man you thought. Distant, absent, more interested in fighting than fathering. I failed you and your mother in ways I can't take back." Michael climbed the porch steps and sat down in the chair beside Will's. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just sat there watching the students file into the schoolhouse, their young voices carrying on the morning air like birdsong. "I'm a teacher," Michael finally said, "in Boston, literature and composition." "I know. I've been proud of you even when I couldn't say it." "Nora thinks this school needs more teachers, especially ones who know the white man's education system from the inside, who can help bridge the gap between what these children need to survive and what they need to remain themselves." Will's heart, his failing, stubborn heart, gave another lurch. "She asked you to come? She gave me information. The choice was mine." Michael turned to look at his father directly, and Will saw Catherine in his son's face so clearly it hurt. "I've been angry at you for 10 years. Angry that you weren't there when Mother died. Angry that you seemed to care more about strangers than your own family. Angry that I had to grow up feeling like I was always competing with ghosts for your attention. You had every right to be angry. Maybe, but I'm tired of being angry. And when I read what Nora wrote about you, about what you did for those girls, about the school you were building," Michael's voice cracked slightly. "I thought maybe I had been wrong. Maybe the man I was angry at didn't exist anymore. Or maybe he never really existed at all. Maybe I just saw what my hurt wanted me to see instead of the complicated truth." Will reached out and placed his hand over his son's. It was the first time they had touched in 10 years, the first time since Catherine's funeral when Michael had refused his father's embrace and walked away without looking back. "I can't undo the past. I can't give you back the father you deserved. All I can do is try to be better with whatever time I have left. Try to make these final days mean something. How long do you have?" The blunt question was so like Catherine that Will almost smiled. His wife had never believed in dancing around difficult truths. Days, maybe a week. Dr. Morgan says my heart is running on nothing but stubbornness at this point. Michael was quiet for a moment, his hand tightening on Will's. Then let's make those days count. Together. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked side by side to finish preparing the school for its official opening. Michael proved to be everything Nora had hoped. A skilled teacher who understood how to make complex ideas accessible. Someone who could help Apache children navigate the intricacies of English grammar and Western literature without making them feel that learning these things meant abandoning their own culture. Will watched his son teach a lesson on composition to a group of teenagers and felt something he had not felt in years. Pure, uncomplicated pride. Michael had become the man Catherine had always believed he could be, had found a way to honor his mother's values while charting his own path forward. The school opened officially in January of 1885. They called it the Broken Arrow Academy, in honor of Samuel, and the first class had 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. They learned reading and writing and mathematics. They learned the history of their own people and the history of the nation that had conquered them. They learned that education was a weapon more powerful than any gun, but only if wielded with wisdom and respect for what came before. Will watched it all from his porch. His body was failing faster now. He could not walk without help, could not speak without running out of breath, could not stay conscious for more than a few hours at a time. But every morning he sat in that chair and watched the students arrive, watched Michael stand at the blackboard teaching lessons that would shape young minds for generations to come, watched Nora manage it all with a grace and strength that Samuel would have recognized and celebrated. On a cold February evening with snow falling softly on the mountains, Nora came to sit with him. The territorial representative had visited that day, she told him, and had been impressed with what they had built. There was talk of using their model for other schools across Arizona, of expanding the program to serve more communities, of proving that education could be a bridge instead of a weapon. Judge Harrison's investigation is nearly complete, Nora continued. The land will be officially restored to us by spring. All of it. The forgeries have been exposed, and several of Landry's associates are facing charges for conspiracy and fraud. Good. Will's voice was barely a whisper now, his lungs struggling to move air past lips that felt numb and distant. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and withdrew something small wrapped in cloth. She pressed it into Will's palm with careful reverence. It was his watch. Catherine's watch. The one he had traded for 6 lives in a dusty slave market that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. How? Judge Harrison tracked it down. The trader sold it to a merchant in Tucson. The merchant sold it to a collector in San Francisco. It took months, but Harrison found it and bought it back. He said, her voice caught. He said a man's compass should be returned to him before the end of the journey. Will looked down at the gold case, felt the weight of it in his palm, remembered Catherine's face when she gave it to him on their wedding day. Her small hands holding his scarred ones, her voice gentle but absolute. To William, my compass in the storm. All my love, Catherine, 1862. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. Nora leaned over and kissed his forehead with the tenderness of a daughter saying goodbye to a father. Thank you, Will, for coming back to Red Mesa, for not riding away, for showing us what honor looks like when no one is watching. That night, Will sat alone on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. The same stars Samuel had watched with him in that cave 24 years ago. The same stars that had guided him through battlefields and deserts and the long journey home to a purpose he had not known he was seeking. He thought about debts and how they were really gifts in disguise. Samuel had given him a second life with a cup of water in the desert, had asked nothing in return except that Will become someone worth saving. For 24 years, Will had carried that gift without understanding what it meant or how to honor it. Now he understood. The debt was not about balance sheets or equivalent exchanges. It was about taking what you had been given and passing it forward, transformed. Samuel's mercy had become Will's courage. Will's sacrifice had become Nora's strength. and Nora's strength would become the foundation for hundreds of children who would learn to navigate between worlds without losing themselves in the crossing. That was what Samuel meant when he said the Chiricahua measured worth by choices made when no one was watching. Not by what you take, but by what you give. Not by what you destroy, but by what you build. Not by how you die, but by how you live. Michael emerged from the schoolhouse, his arms full of papers that needed grading, his face showing the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had spent the day doing work that mattered. He sat down beside his father, and they watched the moon rise over the mountains together, painting everything silver in shadow. "I'm glad I came," Michael said after a while. "I'm glad we had this time." "So am I. Mother would be proud of you. Of this." He gestured at the school, at the life that pulsed within its walls, even as darkness settled over the desert. "She would be proud of you, too. You became the man she always knew you could be." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened, and the temperature dropped, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Will felt his heart slowing, each beat requiring more effort than the last, his body finally ready to surrender the fight it had been losing for months. He was not afraid. Death held no terror for him now. He had done what needed doing, had paid his debts, had built something that would outlast the failing flesh that carried his consciousness through the world. "Michael," he said softly, "there's something I need you to have." He pulled out the piece of leather that Samuel had given him 24 years ago. The moonwing symbol, worn smooth by decades of being carried in his pocket, touched and remembered and treasured. On the back, Will had written something in shaking hand earlier that day. "For Michael, pass it on." Michael took the leather with trembling fingers, understanding without being told what it meant. This was not just a symbol. It was a charge, a responsibility, a reminder that what you received must be given forward. "I'll take care of them," Michael promised. "The school, the students, Nora and her sisters. I'll make sure your legacy continues." "It's not my legacy, it's Samuel's. I was just the messenger." Will closed his eyes and listened to the wind moving through the mountains. Somewhere in the school building, he could hear Nora reading to a group of students by lamplight. Somewhere, Rain Singing was singing a lullaby to Kyle's infant son, the grandson she thought she would never have. Somewhere, Maya was preparing medicine for a student who had fallen ill, turning her own suffering into compassion for others. Life continuing. Life growing. Life winning against all the forces that tried to stamp it out. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since Catherine's death, Will was not afraid of what came next. Not afraid of the darkness waiting at the end of the road, because he knew now that death was not the end. Legacy was the end. The ripples you left behind in the lives you touched, the seeds you planted that would grow long after you returned to dust. Samuel Broken Arrow had understood that. Now Will understood it too. He opened his eyes one more time and looked up at the stars, found the moon rising over the mountains, watched its light spread across the land he had helped save, the future he had helped secure. "Thank you, Samuel," he whispered, "for everything, for the water, for the second life, for teaching me that some debts are really gifts, and gifts are meant to be passed on." The moon rose higher. The wind grew still, and William Hartman, soldier and wanderer and builder of schools, let go of the breath he had been holding for 52 years. When they found him the next morning, he was still sitting in his chair with Catherine's watch in one hand and a peaceful expression on his weathered face. The first thing Nora noticed was that he was smiling. The second thing she noticed was the piece of leather lying on his chest, the moonwing symbol that Samuel had given him so many years ago, now passed to Michael with instructions to pass it on again when the time was right. They buried him on a hill overlooking the school. Michael spoke at the service about a father he was only beginning to know and the legacy he intended to continue. Nora spoke about debts that were really gifts and strangers who became family. Rachel spoke about courage taking many forms and how sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was admit they had been wrong and try to become something better. But it was Ruth who said what everyone was feeling. The 13-year-old stood before the assembled mourners with the poise of someone far older, her voice clear and steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. Grandfather Will saved us. Not just our lives, but our futures. He showed us that one person can make a difference if they're willing to sacrifice for what's right. Now it's our turn to save others the way he saved us. To pass forward what we were given. To make sure his sacrifice means something. The students returned to their lessons. The teachers returned to their teaching. Life at the Broken Arrow Academy continued as it would continue for generations to come. And every year on the anniversary of his death, they gathered on that hill to remember William Hartman, the soldier who learned to build, the wanderer who found his home, the man who honored his debts by turning them into gifts. Epilogue. 15 years later, Ruth Broken Arrow stood in front of a new classroom building and watched the latest group of students arrive. She was 28 now, head administrator of the Broken Arrow Academy, which had grown from 23 students to over 200. The school had become a model for Native American education throughout the Southwest, proving that children could be taught the skills they needed to survive in a changing world without being forced to abandon their cultural identity. Michael Hartman, gray now at the temples but still teaching with the same passion that had brought him here all those years ago, stood beside her. In his pocket he carried the moonwing leather that his father had given him. He had shown it to countless students over the years, using it to teach them about debt and gift, about the importance of passing forward what you had been given. "We're adding another building next year," Ruth said. "A library. We'll name it the Catherine Hartman Memorial Library if you approve." Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion. She would have loved that. She always believed education was the key to everything. She was right. Ruth gestured at the students filing into classrooms, Apache children and white children learning side by side, building friendships and understanding that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. "This is what your father fought for, what my father died for, what all of us have been working toward, a future where our children don't have to choose between survival and identity, where they can be both Chiricahua and American, where they can navigate between worlds without losing themselves." In the distance, they could see the hill where Will was buried. Someone, probably one of the younger students, had placed fresh flowers on the grave. It happened often. The children learned about William Hartman in their history lessons, learned about the old soldier who had given up everything to save 9 girls he had never met, who had built them a school so they could build themselves a future. He had become something of a legend. Ruth suspected he would have been embarrassed by the attention, would have insisted he was just paying a debt, just doing what anyone would do. But she knew better. What Will had done was not what anyone would do. It was what someone with uncommon courage and uncommon compassion would do. It was what someone who had finally learned that the measure of a life was not what you accumulated, but what you gave away. Michael pulled out the moonwing leather and looked at it in the afternoon sun. The symbol was faded now, worn by time and touch, but still visible, still meaningful. "I think it's time," he said softly. "Time to pass it on." Ruth understood immediately. To whom? "Your youngest sister, Luna. She's graduating this year, planning to become a teacher herself. She reminds me of you at that age. Fierce, determined, unwilling to accept that anything is impossible." Ruth smiled. Luna would be honored, and she would understand what it means. Not just the symbol, but the responsibility that comes with it. That evening, at the graduation ceremony for the class of 1900, Michael Hartman called Luna Broken Arrow to the front of the assembly. She was 28 now, no longer the frightened 13-year-old who had clung to Will in an underground river, but the grown woman she had become through education and purpose, and the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself. Michael held out the moonwing leather, and the entire assembly grew quiet. 15 years ago, Michael said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "My father gave me this symbol with instructions to pass it on when the time was right. It represents the light that guides us through darkness and the wings that lift us above our worst selves. But more than that, it represents a truth that both our fathers understood, that what we receive must be given forward. That debt and gift are two sides of the same coin. That legacy is not about what we keep, but what we pass on." He pressed the leather into Luna's palm, closing her fingers around it just as Samuel had done to Will, 24 years ago, just as Will had done to Michael 15 years ago. Carry this with you. Remember what it means. And when the time comes, pass it on to someone who needs reminding that mercy is stronger than cruelty, that building is better than destroying, that the choices we make when no one is watching are the ones that define who we really are. Luna looked down at the symbol in her hand, and tears filled her eyes. She thought of Will, of the old soldier who had given up everything to save her and her sisters. She thought of her father Samuel, who had saved Will and set in motion a chain of events that led to this school, these students, this future that had seemed impossible once. She thought about debt and gift and the way that love multiplies when you give it away. "I'll honor this," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I'll pass it on, and I'll teach my students what Grandfather Will taught us, that we're defined not by what we take, but by what we give. Not by how we die, but by how we live. Not by the debts we're owed, but by the gifts we pass forward." The assembly erupted in applause. Students and teachers, Apache and White, young and old, all of them part of the legacy that Samuel and Will had started with an act of mercy in a desert cave so long ago. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. The school building stood solid against the approaching night, filled with knowledge and hope, and the quiet certainty that some things, some important things, endure. On a hill overlooking it all, a simple grave marker bore testament to a man who had learned too late that love given is never wasted, that sacrifice for others is the highest form of prayer, that debt and gift are really the same thing seen from different sides. The marker read, William Hartman, 1832-1885. Soldier, father, friend. A man is defined by the choices he makes when no one is watching, and beneath it, carved by hands that loved him, he chose well. The stars emerged one by one from the darkening sky, ancient and indifferent and eternal. They had witnessed the birth of the universe and would witness its ending, and in between, they watched countless small lives flare and fade like sparks from a fire. But some sparks, kindled with the right intentions and fed by sacrifice and love, could start fires that burned for generations, could illuminate darkness that seemed permanent, could prove that one person, choosing mercy over cruelty and gift over debt and building over destroying, could change the trajectory of hundreds of lives. William Hartman had been such a spark, and the fire he started was still burning.